we're going to look at passages of Scripture and see how these passages could actually be doing the work of suppressing independent thought.
If I tell you, you won't believe even if you saw something that's super remarkable, then that lowers the bar for me. I never have to produce anything remarkable.
In case you ever stop believing or have a hard time believing, or maybe you even ask for help believing, you are breaking the rules. As he sat down on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, so you already are casting this back to when the temple was standing, right? See what's happening here. Mm-hmm. Opposite the temple. So now the reader says, oh, so okay, the prophets came before the destruction. Cool.
Yeah. It's like, he couldn't have said opposite the temple if the temple was
Exactly. This is great. This is great casting here. So we are back at it. This is the podcast with no name. That's not the name of the podcast. It's not the No Name Podcast. But so far it's just been pull up with Brady Goodwin. These brothers have been pulling up faithfully every week, and I got other people asking, can they pull up? Interesting ideas. People are, hey, are you ever going to have believers pull up and talk to you and have some conversations with them? Definitely plan on doing so. People have also asked, am I ever going to have any women pull up, get a different perspective? Definitely. But so far we really haven't titled this podcast, and to be honest, I haven't been pressed to do so. How about y'all? Have y'all been pressed to we need to call this something?
Nothing comes to mind. Yeah. I think we need to do like a good brainstorm session, maybe. I don't know. Yeah.
I personally think that we already have a name for it. Quite frankly, I think several of you guys might have a slight inkling as to what that might be.
Yeah.
Wait. Yeah. So are you talking about the one that you put forward a while back?
Yes. Do I need to say it again?
No, don't say it.
No, I will say it. The goats.
The goats.
The goats.
And why do you like that name, the goats? Why do you like that name?
Need I say more? Are you not entertained? The goats. Yes. I mean, we're coming in here to claim that we're the goats of this this particular kind of podcast, which is actually pretty easy to plant our flag because there's nobody. We're kind of pioneers. So okay, you set yourself up as the GOAT, the greatest of all time, when nobody else has done it.
So, but it sort of is an underwhelming claim for you to be the greatest at something that no one else is doing.
That's the great irony.
That's the great irony.
That's the great irony.
But no, you also have while you're joking, you also have a biblical reference for your goats, don't you?
Absolutely.
Okay.
The sheep and goats. I'm just, the old N word, they said when it was embraced, you kind of took a little of the sting out of it. So,
So for people that would say that we were never sheep. We're
not part of the fold.
I have a line in one of my songs. Somebody's probably just waiting to pull this. I have a song called We Were They, where I'm talking about how the believer, we used to be the unbeliever. And then at the end of one of the verses, I say, talking about the people that think that they're us, but they're not. I say they might not be sheep, they might be the goats. And so when you were talking about that, I said, man, that would be a great little, part of a theme song to play. One, I don't know if I can get the clearance from Cross Movement Records to use my own voice doing that. But two, here's what I get what you're saying about Christ separating the sheep from the goats. And I think you made a comment before. You said, look, he's taking too long. We'll just do it for him. Like we'll just establish we're the goats. That was hilarious.
like a true preterist in true preterist form. We're just going to go ahead and have at
it. Just own it. Just claim it. But here's why I don't like it for several reasons. One, I don't like it because think about what Jesus was saying there, right? Even if we just reduce Jesus to, yes, he was real, but not Messiah, but he was good teacher. And he taught as a good teacher, he taught about these beneficial ways to be for humanity. And he said, I'm going to separate the sheep from the goats. And here's how you're going to know. The sheep, And then he named the things that the sheep do. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was in prison, you came to see me. And they say, yo, when did we do that? When you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. And then he says, the goats are the ones who would not do those things for the least of these. So by making ourselves the goats in the biblical sense, it's not just some, oh, you guys are like anti-Christ and anti. It's you guys are almost anti-humanity because you're not doing these things for the least of these. So to me,
Yeah,
it puts it in a different category.
I think you're really pressing.
I just heard the atomic bomb go off.
It's just like, come on, like for one, sheep get a lot more, like they get too much credit, in my opinion. I mean, people
Well,
have spoken about sheeple. People know that sheep. I actually think it was a TikTok recently I saw where it was a woman was just running and the sheep were just running, following her for no apparent reason, just because they're followers. And it's like,
well,
so
I mean,
it.
you're kind of going where we're going to go tonight in tonight's podcast. Like, why is it that sheep are talked about in such a prized way in Scripture? Well, like what's going on there? But we'll come back to that in a little while. But go ahead.
I mean, I honestly think that it's pretty simple. I mean, you can understand them as basically farmer agrarians. It was a happy metaphor for the time period.
Well,
It doesn't work
don't chase that now. I'm just saying we're going to
yeah, no.
dive into
This
that.
is just a thought that came into
Yeah.
my head just now while you were saying that. It's just that, some things don't make as much sense now. Like just like the little laugh I got.
No, but I think it does make sense now for what the intended purpose was. But once again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. I don't want to dive into the sheep
Yeah.
conversation
Okay.
yet. I'm just, like you said, sheep get too much credit. Let's leave it there. You like goats.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that I don't have a particular affinity for goats. Although growing up, I didn't mind eating some curried goat. But
But you like the entendre though of greatest
Right.
of all time goats, plus
it's
owning
just-
the biblical label of you guys are not really sheep, you're goats.
it's
You
just
like
like
owning that.
you're the greatest of all time by virtue of being the first to do it. So that's just you can't let these times, you can't let that go. I mean,
Now,
you gotta
we
seize
have
the
all
moment.
kinds of detractors, right? Mm-hmm. When you say we're the first, people will say you're not the first to deconvert. You're not the first to do a podcast.
Yeah, that's a great
Well,
question.
I mean, there's, okay, I take it back. I mean, this is like a true skeptic. I'm not too committed as a skeptic. I'm not dogmatic about almost anything in life. Like, you can have it.
So tonight we're going to talk about being behind bars. Please don't get offended, but this might offend some people. Once you deconvert, it's almost as if your eyes are open, like Adam and Eve when they ate from the fruit, and you become wise. You can kind of look back at your former faith, and you can see, like, yo, that was cap. Like, yo, that when they were saying that was being said to sort of keep me locked in, like almost like, I don't want to say held prisoner or held hostage, but I'm behind the bars of these verses of scripture that if someone uses these verses, they kind of keep me from getting out. You can see this in people who have been in abusive relationships. They look back once they're out and they say, yo, when this person said this, when they did this, I can see how that was trapping me in that relationship. People in other religions, when they deconvert, we played someone who deconverted from Islam in episode 3. We played this clip, and he was looking at the scriptures that helped shut down independent thought and keep him trapped in the religion. And so it's almost this feeling of you realize you were behind bars, but the double entendre comes in. Tonight we're going to look at passages of scripture, and we're going to kind of look in between the lines and go behind the bars of these verses, and see how these passages could actually be doing the work of, uh, like I said, suppressing, uh, uh, chastising people even for expressing independent thought. So, with that being said, I just want to share this idea, um, to kind of get us on this track. I remember reading commentary on the Book of Romans, but this was not from a believer. This was from a liberal theologian, and he was talking about Paul's justification by faith. And he said, when Paul goes to Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, and talks about Abraham being justified by faith, he believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. He said that verse never really had any significance for most people throughout the history of Judaism. And had Paul not seized on it, it would have gone completely unnoticed like almost every other verse you see there. But because Paul seized on it, now that verse became, it's almost like it blossomed and became it became its own lane for the faith, the Christian faith, to thrive in. And so here's what happens though. Abraham believes God, and because he believes God, it's credited to him as righteousness. What does that then mean, especially for Paul? Now the faith is no longer based on, or your relationship with God is no longer based on what you do to please God. It's based on how you think, or what you think, what you trust in to please God. And because your relationship with God is based on what you think, now it's extremely important that the religious community sort of becomes the watchdog to keep a careful eye on what you think, such that if you ever commit what we often refer to as thought crimes, not being able to believe enough, you now are in jeopardy of ruining your relationship with God. So with that in mind, I'm going to come back to that in a little while, but with that in mind, I just want to throw that out there to you guys, just sort of as an on-ramp to begin thinking about this. What does it do for a religion, for a community of believers, community of practices, if someone says this whole faith is hinged on you thinking right about certain things? What kind of pressure does that put on the believers to police and to find ways to ensure that people are thinking right all the time? What are your thoughts about that?
I would just chime in here and make one slight amendment there, because I know there is a listener who's a believer who would say, see, we got him. He's saying it's about your thoughts. And indeed, it's actually the object of your thoughts, the object of your faith. That is, this is the kind of religious jujitsu that they play. Because, I mean, honestly, even if you say it's the object, you can't get around having a thought about the object. But,
right.
Okay, just so you know, we're not unaware of that answer. So I just wanted to put that out. I just wanted to amend that. Just because I know there are people who are going to immediately say, see, I got him. He thinks it's about what he thinks, but it's really about the object of your faith and not you thinking it. You see?
And that's good, too. And so to be clear, but like you said, you're completely right. It's what you think about this object. Even as Hebrews, right? The book of Hebrews says, right? He who comes to God must first believe that he is and that he's a rewarder.
You going to steal my verse?
No, I'm not. I'm just saying.
No, I got you. I got you.
The idea of it's not just the object, it's what you think, and we can substitute think with believe about that object. Abraham.
We can't get around. What I think you're saying is that you really can't get around this concept of thought crime or thought orthodoxy, thought heterodoxy or thought orthodoxy. You can't get around it.
Yeah.
Because it's all based. That's what we call it, the faith.
Right. Any thoughts on that, Albert, in terms of Just what does it do? What kind of pressure or how does it frame a community of believers to be told it's
Yeah,
about what you think here?
it's a dense topic what you're talking about.
Mm.
Here's another slight amendment, I think, to
Mm-hmm.
even what you know. I also believe that when you say mind or belief, you're also encompassing other. I'm assuming it's coming out of you as being a former Reformed Christian, right? Who probably read Gordon Clark and other people who interpret, the heart, mind, and soul as essentially kind of like the mind, right? But I think when you say that though, you are encompassing all aspects of us as our essence, right?
Mm.
So that can encompass your desire, even, right?
Yeah.
And as well as like a cognitive assent to a set of propositions and believing in it, but also having the aspects of duty,
Mm-hmm.
or and things like that. So I'm assuming you're talking about all that. So
Yeah.
I think that would actually account for all of potentially
Mm-hmm.
the
all of the
responses,
rebuttals.
all the
Yeah,
rebuttals.
exactly.
Yes, but yeah, no, I think what you're, it's a constant. I can't count with. I don't know how many times that I've listened to a sermon where it's about your constant self analysis. Those are, if you're coming more from like the evangelical fundamentalist, they have more of that Puritan streak, where it's all about that kind of self analysis and
Almost like a
uh,
pietism.
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 Yeah,
Yeah.
kind of born out of the whole post-Reformation Germany, Zinzendorf, all that stuff. So, which is essentially, you would argue that the fundamentalists have probably more in common with that pietistic tradition than what was considered kind of the Reformed tradition. So, but yeah. I mean, it's definitely about it's a type of social engineering that
That's a good
has
word.
you always questioning yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Always analyzing, always, the constant exhortation to be above reproach, to
Mm-hmm.
be. I think it's all married to that. But I like what you're doing though. I really like how you're connecting it to kind of Paul and reinterpreting the Old Testament that way, and the fact that it's uh, it's interesting. It's interesting.
Well, here's
Yeah. Go
something
ahead.
too to add on that. So we talk about Paul reinterpreting the Old Testament. I cover this in chapter 10 of my book. What Paul is doing is not unique. Paul is part of a trend of people from Judaism who were looking back at their faith and trying to figure out, okay, wait, we were in exile because we were polytheistic. We were put under the thumb of Persia, put under the thumb of Greece, now under the thumb of Rome. And we've been doing our part. We narrowed it down to one God and we've been trying to keep the law. Why are we still not being successful? Aren't we doing all the things that we're supposed to be doing? And so a lot of these Jewish leaders of that time started saying, well, dang, maybe the problem is not that we need to be doing more righteous things. Maybe we're so contaminated that we can't ever do enough. Maybe the problem is deeper than our ability to do right. And that's when they started going back to Adam and Eve, trying to figure out maybe something happened at the beginning of humanity. And Paul sounds just like some of them when he begins to say, "Oh, from one man came sin and sin death." So they're going back to try to find out why can't we ever do right enough. But then this is what Paul does with his innovation. Rather than continuing to make the faith about something that you have to do, because apparently, look, we're still under the thumb of Rome. Apparently, we can't do enough right. Maybe it's not going to be about doing. Maybe the solution is going to be to change it from it's not what you do, it's what you believe. And that's when you seize on Abraham. So we'll look at him. He was justified by not what he did. He's like us. You couldn't do enough right stuff. He was justified by what he believed. And that kind of becomes you pull the switch on the trolley car so that it goes down a different track. And from that moment on, the religion begins to go down the track of you're being justified by faith. So what you believe about God, that's why I'm using the term thought crimes of what you think. You've got to be believing the right things in order for you to be justified now. So, yeah.
You can see how, like, with all of this, you can just see how navel gazing and just sort of how, like, it can lead to a certain kind of. This is the same kind of insanity that led Origen, the great heretic theologian of the early church, to castrate himself. This is the kind of just.
Say more about that, because some people are like, what?
Yeah, no. He
Yeah.
was said to have. There's some who say he went to someone and had them castrate him when he was younger, and others believe he actually removed his own testes because of I believe he was prompted to do this by reference to passage where Christ said, "If your right eye offends you, that you should just basically pluck it out," that kind of thing. This sort of thing led him. He was a youthful man who had to deal with what they would call youthful lust, and well, how do you deal with it? Well, he felt like it was better to go in maimed, literally, and this is literally insanity.
Wait, finish that thought. He thought it would be better to go in maimed. What are you talking about?
Go into the kingdom, go into heaven maimed, than to have his unmaimed body essentially send him to hell. Essentially,
Right.
So that's the. But this is madness. A man mutilating his body, but you don't need to go to Origen. You can just look at the self-flagellation of the monks of the Middle Ages. I mean, and there are all kinds of iterations of this kind of behavior that have trickled down even to modern day evangelicalism.
Well, here's what's wild about what you're saying, because even though Paul pulled the lever to make the trolley car go from works to faith, because it's such a man, I got to keep my mind on the right track. But that's so hard to do. You still have people doing things by works because I can't keep it up. I still can't be right enough even mentally. I can't always be faith. I believe, but help my unbelief. And so it's weird that, it's by faith, but there's still this element of I've got to do something to work this out.
It's literal insanity. A perfectly sane young man can be driven almost insane by the fact that his biology is working against what he's assenting to intellectually and in the terms of his faith. And so you have Christians who have totally inconvenienced their entire lives. They might have their internet even rigged up where they can't even use the internet because they're afraid they're going to see something and then start lusting. So, so their whole life ends up being this is just to bring it full circle back to the behind bars. They end up being imprisoned in this world of ideas, this world of ideas that's dictating to them. I was listening to a minister at one point who was even implying that you could sin in your sleep. And he was basing this on, he's on scriptures that talk about filthy dreams that people have. And so this in the Middle Ages, they had witches that they would think would come to people in their dreams and stuff. It's like, once you start going down the rabbit hole of nonsensical, non-falsifiable religious beliefs, there is no end to it. And there is no end to the kind of, I never forget, and I'll stop here, sitting around with young brothers and listening to Piper basically talking essentially almost of a suicide missional trips, like suicide missions almost, like commending people who go off into these places of the world where they might lose their lives and this is wicked stuff. This is evil. To come to young men who are seeking guidance and you have older men, the way they do in war in countries, send the young men off to war and stuff. To send people in a time when they're most impressionable off into the world, thinking that the best thing they can do for their lives is to lose their lives in a trip to try to convince people of a myth. This is evil. This is adulterated
And
evil.
of course, for them, they don't think they're doing it in the name of a myth. They think they're doing it in the name of, I'm going to go get these other people to think the right things about God so that they can be saved too.
Yeah, absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. Well, so let's dive in because um, Abraham believed God; it was counted to him as righteousness. Paul makes that this is the ticket to the kingdom. But now you've got to believe God too. You've got to believe all these right things about God. But in case you ever stop believing or have a hard time believing, or maybe you even ask for help believing, you are breaking the rules because to ask God for help is just a bit too much. To ask God to, even though you have one person who said, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief," and people always say like almost like that's how merciful God is, that God will allow you to pray something like that. But I don't know if that's true. I don't know if God really will allow you to pray something like that because, so for instance, Matthew 12:30, somewhere in the 12:30s. Let me pull it up here. Let me share my screen. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, they're talking to Jesus, saying, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you." But he answered them, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." In the heart of the earth, y'all. Uh, and so let's just stop there. So a lot of people go to this passage whenever a believer says, "Hey, I am having a hard time believing, and I would love for God to say or do something, anything." Um, but a lot of times believers don't actually ask God to say or do anything because they're almost paralyzed by this passage because it's evil and perverse to seek for a sign. So even if you are, like, how do you at the same time say, "I believe, but help my unbelief"? Now, maybe you could say that to Jesus when he was right in front of you, but these people, and I know somebody would probably say, well, these were Pharisees. They didn't believe anyway. Even if he did give them a sign, they probably still wouldn't believe. Okay, but what stops the believer today from being able to say, "Man, God, can you give me a sign?" In their heart, there's this trembling of, I can't even ask God to do that because that's evil and perverse. I can't do that. Do you see how this passage could actually be used, or when as you look back, did you ever feel like you couldn't ask God for a sign because that would be evil and perverse?
Yes. Are you talking about something miraculous,
Yes.
particularly?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, of course, yeah, and
Yes. So when
and
they say,
especially
"Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you," they're
right,
asking for a miracle.
something miraculous,
Yeah.
right? And then he gives us something that's actually not miraculous. He's just trying to prophesy about anyway. But yeah, absolutely. There is. Well, it didn't help that I went to MacArthur's church for a little while because of his very anti-charismatic rhetoric about signs and wonders and things like that. But there was also the apologetic talking point about how signs and miracles never convert anyone either. So that was kind of their way of interpreting. When they talk about the nature of saving faith and things like that, right? They always say that none of that has ever occurred in the New Testament. I think I remember someone saying that actually, and now that I think about it, I don't think that's true at all.
Well, I
Right.
mean,
Actually,
Christ,
yeah.
Christ,
So
Christ himself says like they wouldn't believe if one were raised for, and this is like foreshadowing his own resurrection. But
right,
it's like, is that really? You could
yeah,
just envision Homer Simpson or somebody in the corner being like, really? Like if they saw the person raised from, you think they really wouldn't believe?
yeah.
Like this is like I don't know. I mean, this seems like a little. That seems like a little gaslighting too. It's like
It,
well,
it's a
I'll
it's a
never.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of contradictory kind of claims and statements going on
No, it's
about, how
purposeful.
this
That's
is,
engineering. That's
right.
purposeful because if I tell you you won't believe even if you saw something that's super remarkable, then that lowers the bar for me. I never have to produce anything remarkable.
Right.
You
Because
know,
it's like, then I can just tell you, well, you wouldn't have believed anyway, so that's why I'm not producing it. It's like, no, you're not producing anything remarkable because you can't do it.
Right.
That's what
But,
it
but
is.
but who was it? Was it one of you just talked about this idea of it makes you be much more self-analytical though, because now you're looking back at yourself like, what's wrong with me that I would even
something.
like? Why would I even ask God for a sign? That's so foul of me, my evil, wicked heart, that I would
It,
ask God for a sign.
but it's like your bluff never gets the opportunity to be called if you present it in such a way that you convince your hearer that what they need is not you to prove that there's anything metaphysical going on by just demonstrating it. See, it's very easy to demonstrate metaphysical reality. All you have to
Yeah.
do is just do something miraculous, and then you can prove. It's like what Christ said when he's like, "What's easier to do, to tell the guy his sins are forgiven, or to actually heal him in front of you?" And so
Right.
the answer to that would be like, "Well, to heal somebody in front of you. Well, just so you know that I have the ability to actually forgive sins, I'm going to heal this person in front of you." So he does it in the story, but ironically, in real life, we
Wait, I
have
think you
these.
said it. I think you said it backwards when he said, "What's easier to do?"
Oh yes, 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 yes.
Yeah,
You hear what I'm saying?
it's easier to say your
Yeah,
sins are forgiven than it is
yeah.
to heal somebody. So if
That's what I
I'm
said.
saying, oh well, I thought
Yeah,
you
that's
said
what I
it's
was saying.
easier to heal somebody.
No, no, no. I was saying it's easier to tell somebody that their sins are forgiven than
Right.
to
Yeah.
than to heal them. But just so you know that I can forgive sins, I'm going to heal this person in front of you. So that the harder thing, it's an a fortiori argument. It's them saying this argument from the greater to the lesser. If I can do this, the lesser feat, you will then know that I've also been able to accomplish.
Right.
And it's like, well, they tell you that in the story. That's the irony of all of this stuff. But in real life, then they dish you up cessationism.
Right.
Well,
Right.
how convenient is it that we're not? Guess what? Lucky for us, we're no longer in the era. You know what I'm saying, of
Yeah.
miracles.
Yeah. And we'll get to more of those passages in a second.
We're
But
no longer in that era. So
so
that's lucky for us because that makes our belief actually more substantive because we don't ever have to make it based on actually seeing anything, right?
yeah.
It's just like,
So and here's what's interesting.
There we go.
Let's go back and look at Abraham. So I'm going to say some things that probably will shock people, but try to get past the shock value to get to my actual point. So here you have God coming to Abram and saying, "Hey, I'm going to do something miraculous for you. I'm going to give you a child." Because Abraham's telling God, like, "Yo, here I am. I'm old. All I have is servants. They're going to be my heirs. I got no son. You never gave me a son." God says, "You're going to have a son. Look at the heavens. If you could number those stars, God will be like numbering your offspring." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." And he, that's Abraham, believed the Lord. Now, I would love to see some Hebrew scholars talk about this next part here, because when it says, "And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness," I am not. This is going to sound crazy, I know. It's not clear who the he is that's doing the counting to him as righteousness here. Paul immediately takes this as God counting it to Abraham as righteousness. I would love to hear someone talk about, could this also be, because who's doing the action here? The he here is Abraham doing the action. This verb is talking about Abraham. Abraham believed. He believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. Could this be Abraham counting it to God being righteous, blessing God for, "You're going to give me a son"? So I wonder, like, to what degree this could be actually not even the thing that Paul made it. But that's not even my point. That's just something to think about.
yeah, and it's just another thing. Incidentally, I'm noticing looking at this. I wonder if the word number in verse 5 is related to counted in verse 6. Like, so I wonder if in Hebrew there's some sort of play on the word.
Yeah.
I might be wrong.
Yeah.
It's just like in English, it just seems like there might be also a play on
Yeah.
words going on
Yeah.
here.
Could be. Could be. But here goes the more interesting thing. That's just food for thought, but here goes the more interesting thing here. And he said to him, now we know who the he is because the he is going to do some acting, another verb here. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he, this is Abraham now, said, O Lord, how am I to know that I shall possess it? And now all of a sudden you have the man who quote unquote believed God asking God for what? A sign.
A sign.
Like, how crazy is that? That you have this person who, if Paul is right, that God counted it to Abraham for believing him. Now I'm going to count that as your righteousness. Well, Abraham, as much as he believed God, still had the nerve to say, but how do I know this is going to happen?
And wouldn't you say here that a precedent is being set? Because Paul pulls from this, and this is a precedent that's being set for all of us who are the children of Abraham, who have. So if the initial act of faith is a precedent, then wouldn't the subsequent act of asking for a sign also be
so? How could it
that
be
we could draw from
perverse and wicked to ask for a sign if the founder of the faith needed a sign before he could actually be? I believe you, but I need to see something.
Well, I mean, he's a wicked and adulterous generation, in the words of Christ.
I mean, what does it say? What does it say?
Hey, don't ask me. I didn't write this. You got to edit that out. I didn't write the book, though. I didn't write the book, man. Don't ask me.
Jesus is the true sign, and therefore that's what this is pointing to.
Yeah, it's a convenient answer.
But
yes.
God gave him one. Bring me a heifer, 3 years, and a male goat, and here you have the whole idea of God cutting the animal in half and making the covenant with him. Like, this is a sign. This is a token that God's really going to do.
Brady, he was much more important in redemptive history than Brady, Jay Witt, or Albert. He was definitely more important than us.
Well, like
and
Albert
so
said,
he got to have that privilege.
Well, like Albert said, though, we get it too because Jesus becomes our lamb or our ram. That's that's
yeah. All of them have been conveniently spiritualized. Yes,
yeah.
They've all been conveniently spiritualized.
But the thing is, Abraham got to see that sign.
Yeah,
right.
We don't get to see it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and this brings us to the next passage. So here we have John chapter 20, verse 24. Here's where we get the phrase doubting Thomas from. Jesus had already appeared to most of the disciples and showed them that he was alive. But Thomas was not there. So now verse 24. Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, we've seen the Lord. But he said to him, unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe. Now think about how defiant this man was. I will never believe. Well, what does God do? 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them this time. How convenient. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. He said to Thomas, put your finger here. See my hands? And put your hand here. Place it in my side. You believe? Do not disbelieve, but believe. Thomas answered him, my Lord and my God. OMG. Jesus said to him, now see, you believe because you've seen me. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet still believe.
This is engineering.
Why? Why do you say that?
Well, I mean, for one, it didn't happen. I'm just gonna go out. I'm gonna take a gambler's. No, I'm not gonna. I'm just gonna put my bet out here, and I will put money on the fact that this didn't happen.
Okay.
But there's no need to do that. But also, you can see when I'm talking about engineering. So you take out the whole money thing, but when I'm speaking of engineering, I'm saying this writer, the writer being John, he's speaking to his audience really directly. So this is a sort of in movies, I call this heavy-handed filmmaking,
Okay.
because this is almost ventriloquism. He's using these characters to display another reference to Ayn Rand. She was heavy on that in her book, The Fountainhead. She would use her characters, and you would get page after page of a long speech, and she's basically using this character to speak to her audience through.
Right.
And similarly here, Thomas, whether he existed or not, it probably didn't even exist. He's just the character who's being used here to stand in a place of an audience and say, okay, so he's like, I won't believe unless I see these, which, by the way, that's a reasonable way to be. Like,
and it's probably an indication that there were people in the community who were saying this.
Yeah. And it's just not unreasonable. If somebody told you that somebody you just saw crucified was alive and walking around, it's not unreasonable. Like, the whole moniker Doubting Thomas that he gets, is like he gets this bad rap. It's like, yo, that's a reasonable thing to be like, all right, y'all all are saying this.
He should
I
be
wasn't
called
there.
Reasonable Thomas.
Yeah. Reasonable doubt. Right? So you say, hey, you guys all got the privilege of seeing him, supposedly. So I don't want anything exceptional. I just want to have the same thing you had, the opportunity to see him before I say why would I just believe it? And I didn't, how can I have nothing to base that on. So just let me see. But clearly the writer, John, or whoever wrote this book, he has an audience in mind. And the goal, if you said like there was a target, the target is verse 29. But he has to get you to verse 29. So he tells you this ridiculous, untrue story, like guys walking through walls and so forth, to get you to the statement in verse 29 where he says, have you believed because you've seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed.
That's blessed of those is all the audience.
Yes. And that's the goal of this entire pericope of Scripture. He's trying to get you to that point, to tell you that the audience, by and large, the audience will not have seen him, but whether or not Christ is mythical or not, we've gone back and forth on that. Even if he was an actual historical, he's dead at this point, so they won't have seen him. So he's trying to get his audience to buy into this idea that there's somehow a more blessedness in believing and not having seen. And it's like, if you think about it, they're quite blessed even if they have seen, right? Thomas, we don't think of Thomas as being tortured by imps in hell. It's like, so it's not like on the other side is cursedness. It's just like, you know what I mean? I'll leave it there.
Albert, has this verse, as a Christian, did that verse shore you up? And how do you look at it now, having deconverted?
Yeah, Jesus favors credulity, right? He elevates the credulous mind, not the incredulous, tendencies of Thomas of being. But I mean, this is literally the what do you call it? The complement of all compliments, right? This is the gold standard for how a Christian must, or how a person must conduct themselves in, when it comes to, Jesus and believing in him. So, of course, this is going to create, a pathology of sorts, right? In a mass of people and community where, it's all about that questioning, right? Do you truly believe, and things like that. So, but yeah, it's, this is literally the nail on the head right here. Like this exemplifies, everything that's wrong with the unquestioning aspects of, and not really encouraging, healthy doubt, as opposed to how, pastors and others have talked about doubt, right? They always talk, Tim Keller has talked about doubt being a good thing. Well, is it? I mean, I don't know. Apparently not, according to this passage. So, what The common thread that I'm finding, like ever since we've started on this conversation, is this constant qualification that you have to do as a Christian to make sense of anything. And it's just exhausting. It's mentally exhausting to even try to harmonize any of this.
Yeah.
Let alone the fact that we're not even talking about our own faiths or whatnot. It's like, how do
Yeah.
you even make sense of any of this?
So can
When
I
you look
just?
at verse,
Well, go ahead.
when you look at verse 30, it's like it almost turns it on its head too, because he's like, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus. So it's like he's just going around just throwing, like he's got signs out the wazoo for them, and they just write them down so that you might believe. It's like, so clearly signs play a role in that economy in terms of proving things. But at the same time, so this is why it leads to a certain kind of insanity, because what are the point of the signs if not to convince people?
Well, and also look at what's happening. I'm glad you took us to verse 30 because look what's happening. He did these signs, and like you said, what was the point of them if not to produce faith in people or confirm faith in people? But then these were written so that you might believe. Wait, he did signs for them, but you wrote about them for us? It's
Yeah.
equating the writing with the actual signs. So
Right.
you don't
Well,
get the signs,
it's-
but you get the writing. You should believe because you got the writing, not the signs.
And you should also just believe that he did many other, like, very non-specific, just kind of generalized. It's like, yeah, he just was throwing out mad signs, you know? And we didn't bother even... there was such a surplus of signs, we didn't even bother writing them all down.
Well, yeah, because the books couldn't even be contained. You know,
Couldn't be contained.
the books couldn't be
He
contained.
says-
If
He
we
says
tried.
that here, which are not written in this book.
Yeah.
Many that we didn't, he just had... just had mad signs that just got recycled or whatever, thrown into the bin or whatever.
Now there
that
are
one's on the house.
But there is a breed of Christian, the charismatic, who would say, no, the signs are still happening. So for them, okay, we have to have a separate conversation. But for the Christians who would say, well, I mean, we don't see those kind of signs, right? You have to ask yourself, look at verse 30. Are the writings, so verse 30 and verse 31, is the writing about these things as powerful as if the things themselves had actually happened? And if so, why? Why am I willing to embrace and accept the writing of signs as if they are the signs?
Right.
Well, based on the book of John and this passage here, I would have to probably say that the cessationists, they probably have some kind of strength on their side of the argument for sure, because it seems to be assumed here that they were in a, you know what I mean?
The signs are not going to keep coming.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the signs they're over. Basically, you're getting into the John's writing this, or whoever wrote this. You're talking about the end of the first century here, and so this is after Corinthians. This is after all of this. So that community is probably asking not only did he really rise. They probably are saying what's being said here by Thomas. Until I can place my hand, I'm not going to believe. But they probably also are saying, hey, what about all them signs we kept hearing about? Can we get some of them? So he's killing two birds with one stone. Here's why you can't see him, because more blessed are you if you believe without it. And here's why you're not going to get the signs, because you got the writing. This is just as good.
Yeah, the writing's even better, actually. He might have raised Lazarus from the dead, but sure. I mean, he might not be raising your loved one from the dead, but I mean, you have the story of him doing it for somebody else. That's more valuable.
Yeah.
I actually used to believe this stuff, man. This is crazy.
Please, listener, viewer, if you see us smirking, laughing, or whatever, even somebody looks at this and says, this was nonsense. We don't say this to be offensive, or to even demean or call people who still believe this stupid or anything like that. But stepping outside of it and looking back and sort of seeing it from this perspective, once again, I don't know what else to say other than we're not trying to be offensive, but it really it shows for what it really is. It shows this is the product of men trying to convince doubting people, a doubting community, why they should still accept this. Because
Mm-hmm.
keep in mind, decades have passed since a Jesus would have lived.
Mm-hmm.
And people are trying to figure like, yo, he said he was coming. Y'all said he coming back, right? Like we're not seeing the miracles. We're not seeing him return. We're not seeing any of the things that you told us we'd see. Why should we still believe this? And so when you read these texts, you've got to kind of have in mind, what are they trying to do? What are they trying to shore up for the people who are hearing and reading these passages of scripture?
Yeah, this is what we're constantly referring to as engineering. This is the general feel of what we have in mind when we're using the words like, "Oh, the text has been engineered." We understand there are multiple authors and that they are also not functioning as a monolith.
Right, they're not in agreement.
But we do understand that there is a sort of self-conscious by certain authors. There's a self-conscious engineering of this faith to present people with certain. It's engineered in a way to basically stop people from asking certain questions. That's basically that's what we're getting at today. It's engineered to control, to fence in your thinking, and to help you to people like us who are presenting you with an alternative view to tell you basically don't listen to people like that. Like it's engineered in that way too. So it's also it's to modify your thinking, to imprison your thinking, to put it in bars, but also to keep you from paying attention to people who will say, "Look, you're being lied to, you're being had."
So this is, let me just go, I didn't plan on going to this one yet, but as you're saying that, this website that has some of the top verses that kind of do that, they kind of fence people in. And we're going to try to look, behind these bars here, but to go along with what you just said,
Okay.
think about this. You talked about being fenced in. And
Mm-hmm.
if the writer of John, if you're writing this at the end of the first century, and you got Christians kind of looking at the front door like, yo, should I dip? Is he really going to return? Is this really going to happen? And then think about this writer writing things like this. It's John 15:6. Jesus saying, so once again, you have the, like you talked about, this heavy-handedness, the writer putting words in the mouth of the character. This writer puts these words in Jesus' mouth to this community that's tempted to doubt. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. Like if you're a doubting or tempted to doubt Christian, maybe you're the one that says, hey, I believe, but help my unbelief. And then they throw this one at you. like, Albert, I see you shaking your head. I'm just curious, like, what do you think if that's you? When someone says, yo, if you don't remain in me, we talked about people who are in abusive relationships, right? You can't leave. When I was a kid, we used to watch this movie called The Burning Bed, where there was a woman who was abused by her husband. And like after a year, she had kids with him, and every time she tried to leave, he would just pop out of nowhere. And one day she just while he was asleep, burnt the crib down while he was in it. But if you don't remain in me, you're like a branch that's thrown away, and you'll be picked up and thrown into the fire and burned. How does that hit you? I mean, just
It's a lot of fear. It's a lot of, one of the it has the language of being isolated. You'd be isolated. You'd be, and that's essentially one of the worst things that you can do to a human being is put them in solitary confinement. So it's a very deep. The language itself is very deep, right? It's something that hits kind of at the core psychologically, and what's also interesting, I think, I didn't know exactly how you were going to approach all this, and I thought, I'm actually pleasantly surprised, but but it's the one of the other aspects that I think, it's all related to this, but I think that church polity is also organized from Scripture, in a way to also kind of keep you in as well. So one of the things that I, recollect being at MacArthur's was, we had a at least one church member, maybe every 2 months, being, on public display on the pulpit for, an unrepentant sin.
Hmm.
And it was very explicit. I mean, not getting into details, but it was explicit about what this person did and what they did and how they're screwing up. And that's private, it's private information that you just told several thousand people, and it's like that scared the hell out of me. It's like I don't want to be in that position.
Apparently, it didn't scare enough of the hell out of you.
At the time, it did as a 18, 19-year-old. Being at that church.
I'm kidding.
So
Yeah.
it's but you're right. It's there's these low level kind of instances of being put in places where you're exposed and you're ashamed, but more importantly, it comes down to the mind game, the entire fear that's being cultivated and planted in you about, because of all this language. It's very, yeah, it's very powerful in that way. It's the reason why people don't leave.
There are no few passages in the New Testament where, clearly this is an ongoing problem. People defecting, people apostatizing, because there are a lot of verses devoted to this topic. So, and this creates, it's an antagonistic relationship with the person, the outsider, the person who has defected, but also it creates turbulences within the person who's in. So that's why the word thought crime, which I believe is Orwellian, I think it comes from the book 1984. I think it's one of the best ways to describe it. I mean, which describes this autocratic, dictatorial government, and this is not unlike that. It's like a book out of the page of one of those sort of dictators' manuals. It's like you dictate the way people think. We're under a theistic dictatorship. You're telling people you can't think antithetically, you can't have doubts. I mean, even as we saw in the passage that was illustrated, where doubt would be reasonable. I mean, people don't just get up off of crosses and start walking around after they've been put to death. So let's just understand, doubt, when someone tells you something like that, that's not an incorrect, that's a proper response to that data. But the text, this is the turbulence it creates in a person, because it's natural if you didn't see a person who's everybody's saying they saw him raised from the dead to say, well, I'll wait for, if he had it, if it was good enough for him to show it to you 11, then maybe he'll show himself to me. I mean, I'm just one extra person. That's not a bad thing. But somehow they've convinced us that this is the wrong way to go about it.
It's funny that we never question, because so much of the Bible uses filial language, right? And very, very evocative, references to nature, like the vine and things like that. So, I feel like in any real world scenario, when people use filial language to encourage or any, or just discourage any kind of free thinking, things like that. It's reasonable to be suspicious of such, behavior. But it's hard that the filial language is so strong, right? When we talk about adoption and Jesus and the Father and things like that, it's like engineered all the way up to the top.
Yeah, I mean, people say
that's kind of how
they'll say no man has ever spoken like this. It's like, oh, really? Like every cult leader that's ever existed on the planet has had this sort of kind of talk,
Wow. And when you think about that, one of the things that hit me was how cultish the faith that I had was, this idea about if you don't abide, if you don't remain here, Like that's cultish. But once again, it's that thought crime element. It's that, hey, you can be justified
Right.
by believing or thinking the right things about God. But if you stop thinking the right things, and of course, the right things are what come from our body of belief. You stop thinking those things, and now we do otherize you. We do put you outside the fence. Um, I was going to go to this passage here from Acts, because Albert, you just talked about not you're not allowed to be suspicious, and so I want to talk about just a couple of verses that keep people from being suspicious. And we're going to kind of look behind the bars of this passage here. So we got Acts 17, Paul and Silas in Berea. Uh, they were sent there by night to Berea. They got there and they went into the Jewish synagogues. And of course, Judaism is popping at this time. They go to the Jewish synagogues. The Jews, now think about this. Now, these particular Jews in Berea were more noble than those in Thessalonica. So you can already see here the writer has an agenda. The writer is trying to almost say, hint, hint, hey, y'all in Thessalonica, something's wrong with y'all. Y'all are not like these other Jews. What's the difference? The Jews in Berea were more noble. How? They received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Many of them, therefore, believe. So what is that saying? If you really were to study the scriptures and examine them daily, if you were to do what you should do, what would you find out? Well, if you're noble, you would find out that this is worth believing. What Paul is saying is worth believing. His new twist on the Old Testament is really there. And how do you know? You would have to examine the scriptures daily to see that. If the Jews in Thessalonica were to say, well, we examined the scriptures and we don't get that, well, you know what the problem is, right? You're not as noble as these. If you were noble, you would get it, but you're not. Therefore, you don't get it. And so there's almost this engineering here of it almost predisposes or preconditions people on, if you want to be credited with having good character, you're going to have to come to the same conclusion that these Bereans did. You'd have to end up believing. Otherwise, it's not about Paul, it's not about the scriptures, it's something wrong with you. And so for anybody who's reading this, whether it be in the first century or today, if you read this and you don't get it, don't blame Paul. Don't blame the Old Testament. You're the one that's not noble enough to get what's really going on here.
Yeah. Incidentally, what did they say? Their examination of it should be telling to people who are saying, "Oh, you wanted all your questions answered." Well, they were clearly coming to the text. Even here, the text seems to co-sign people wanting questions answered. I mean, what are you doing when you're examining it? So some people
it co-signs it, but it doesn't.
No, I agree with everything you were just saying. I'm just saying, like on some level, the whole act of having questions that you're trying to answer and struggling with them isn't because I've seen people dismiss your whole thing as like, oh, well, he's not here to answer your questions.
Right. Brady wants all his questions answered, and that's not what God's going to do.
And it's like the text is seemingly implying that the text itself can answer those questions. That's all I'm saying. Yeah. But I agree with everything you said, though. Yeah.
Well, here's where this. I hate using this word because I know it sounds ugly, but here's where the scam comes in. Just like Jesus on the road to Emmaus, he took them, through the prophets and through Moses and showed them how all the scriptures spoke about him. But the writer doesn't show us what Jesus showed them. It just tells us he did it.
Right.
And here it doesn't show us what the Bereans discovered. It just tells us they found it. And so it sets you on the enterprise of, well, I guess I got to go discover what they discovered because I don't know what it is. I just know it's possible to do it because the text said it's possible to do it. Now I'm going to spend the rest of my life and we're going to have Bible colleges and seminaries and libraries full of books of people trying to help us do what Jesus did on the road to Emmaus and what the Bereans must have done, even though we don't really know what they did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It doesn't sound like, because what they talked about when they're talking about the scriptures, they're talking about the Old Testament, and I feel like we don't really have it. Like what they're saying sounds a lot more inflated than how even the New Testament would describe the Old Testament. that's
Well,
kind of
say more about that, because I think I know what you mean. But say more. What do you mean?
So they really, like, if you're talking about how the Old Testament points to Jesus, in what instance, and how does that methodology operate and work? I don't believe the New Testament stands up to the muster of what they're claiming here in the passages that they're saying. I think that's
because when you look at a lot of the New Testament allusions from the Old Testament, allusions to the Old Testament, you look at some of the passages and you're like, wait, that's what you.
That's how you interpret it.
Out of his belly will flow rivers of living water. Like, you look at where you're getting this from, you're like, wait, what? Like that's messianic?
Right.
How?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you don't have the Spirit, Brady. So that's clearly the case.
No, but if all they're doing is trying to make like equations of like archetypal things,
well, you don't have the Spirit either, Albert.
Isaiah 50. Like, if that's all it is, then that's really
imagine they just got up. Imagine they just got up and said, "Hey, I'm going to just give you some pretty lackluster. I'm going to pull from this text and pull from it lackluster allusions to Christ." And then if you don't get it, I just say, "Hey, man, you're just unregenerated, man. Like, you can't believe because you haven't been given a new heart.
Or you're just not as noble as the Bereans, or something. Whatever the problem is, it's with you, not the text.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, their nobility that's a metaphysical nobility. You think that you think they were born with that nobility? That was given to them by the Spirit. This is the Spirit care package, man. He gives them the nobility. He gives them the ability to understand and buy into horrible archetypes. Like, come on, man. Like,
so think about this ties into the 1 John passages, right? They went out from us because they were never, if they were with us, they would have never gone out from us. But here you have in 1 Timothy, the Spirit clearly says, now we don't know how the Spirit clearly says this. I guess this is revelation of Paul. But it's so clear, that the Spirit says, in latter times, some will abandon the faith and follow deceiving spirits and things taught by demons. Such teachings come through hypocritical liars whose consciences have been seared as with a hot iron. Whatever else we want to say about this, I just want to say one thing. When I deconverted, I remember there were believers who were very close to me, who I love. And they were almost like elated because they were like, it was almost like they were so desirous, so desperate to see the scriptures come alive, that it was almost like finally something the Bible says would happen, happened. Jesus told us that in the last days, many would fall away from the faith. And now it's happening.
And I don't believe with you politically. It's like, I get that, and for good measure.
Well, no, these people, they actually agree with me on some of the political, social stuff.
Oh, really? Really?
It was the being able to feel like if a great falling away is happening, yes, I knew it. This thing is real. But here's the thing. All these passages that talk about in the last days, what a lot of Christians don't really like to consider, is they believed it was the last days then. These writers are writing to shore people up because they think Jesus is coming back soon. So in Mark 13, Jesus tells his disciples, hey, see this temple here? They said, teacher, look at the temple. Look at the wonderful stones. Look at the buildings. And Jesus said to him, do you not see these great buildings? There will not be left one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Now, a lot of Christians don't realize this. A lot of scholars look at this and say we can kind of tell that Mark here is writing after the destruction of the 70 AD. The Jewish temple was destroyed.
Right.
Mark is writing after that. We know because this sort of is an unbelieving premise or bias here, but there's some other factors about who Mark's writings look like that kind of tell you where this writing happened. But the idea that Jesus foretells the destruction of the temple, a lot of critical scholars would say, okay, this probably is not a foretelling. This probably happened, and the author here is looking backwards and putting these words in the mouth of Jesus to make Jesus look
Right.
prophetic here.
Yeah, they say the same thing about the prophets of the Old Testament, and
Yeah,
particularly
yeah.
Right.
It's called ex eventu. Somebody is writing ex eventu, meaning after the event, to make it look like the prophecy came
Right.
before the event. But here's the thing here. As he says this, they say to Jesus, now think about what's going on, people. Think about what's happening. You're a Jew. Maybe you're a Christian who's a Jew. And you've been told that Jesus was the Messiah. When the Messiah comes, something's going to happen for Israel. They're going to ascend on the world stage to some degree. Even if the nations come to worship Yahweh, something's going to happen for Israel. And now that the Messiah, Jesus, has come, and now he's not here, but you've been told, but don't worry, he's going to return, and then your temple gets destroyed, you're like, yo, what's going on here, right? So that's the setting here. That's the setting. So then you put these words in Jesus' mouth, but what the writer is trying to do is he's trying to show them, don't worry, y'all. I know it looks bad for us. Our Messiah isn't here, and our temple is destroyed. But let me just let you know, these are really just the signs that it's about to pop off. Don't defect. Don't lose your faith. Don't go away. It's about to happen. How do we know? Because Jesus told us it was going to happen, and then he said this, and then you put these other words in his mouth. Verse 3. As he sat down on the Mount of Olives, opposite the temple, so you already are casting this back to when the temple was standing, right? See what's happening here. Opposite the temple, so now the reader says, oh, so okay, the prophets came before the destruction. Cool.
yeah. It's like he couldn't have said opposite the temple if the temple wasn't there.
Exactly. This is great. This is great casting here.
It's like, how can you sit opposite of the temple if it's already gone?
Right.
That's so ridiculous.
Peter, James, John, and Andrew, they asked him privately, okay, so if the temple was standing when this is all going on, they asked him, tell us when these things are going to actually happen. What will be the signs that it's about to be
Why are you
accomplished?
asking for another sign, man? He already
But
like
the signs
told
are.
you. He already told you signs are bunk, man. He already told you signs are bunk.
The signs are important because, well, first of all, that was John that told you that. This is a different. Depiction.
But you don't believe in the harmony of the text, I guess.
Right. But the signs are important because the people who are doubting and getting ready to defect, they need to know, don't defect, because all these things that are making you about to defect, they're the signs that he's about to return. So you got one foot out the door, and then someone says, hey, those signs that are troubling you are actually good signs. You turn back like, oh, really? Tell me more. So then he says this, verse 4, tell us when these things, when will these things be? What are the signs that they're about to be accomplished? Jesus says to them, see that no one leads you astray. Don't leave for some other reason. Many will come in my name saying, I am he, lead you astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Now think about what's going on at that time, right? The Jewish war. All these things are in the air. This must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. So it's almost like you got a lot to look forward to. Don't leave yet. The movie's just getting good. The end is not yet. Nation will rise against nation. kingdom against kingdom, earthquakes in various places.
All things that have always happened.
Right. There will be famines. These are, but hold on. Those are just the beginning of the birth pains. But be on your guard. They will deliver you to councils, and you'll be beaten in the synagogues. And
So it gives you an idea of what was happening. They were already being persecuted on some level. Yeah.
It's going to get rough. Because remember, the reason why Jay Witt can say that is the people who are hearing this are not thinking these things are going to happen in the future. He's already cast this scene back to when the temple was standing. So this is going to, hope this doesn't confuse you, but he's trying to make them think we are now living in the future from when Jesus said these things. They're happening now. We're living in prophecy that's being fulfilled. Be on your guard. They'll deliver you over to the councils. You'll be beaten in the synagogues. Like Jay Witt said, these are the things that are happening presently for them, but being cast in the past as if Jesus foretold them. The gospel must be preached, proclaimed to the nations, and when they bring you, he's saying this to people who are still standing. When they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious before what you would say for that hour. In that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit, and brother will deliver brother over for death. You got Christians turning each other in, and the father his child. The children will rise against the parents. Now,
you can almost picture the audience. If this were real, you could turn this into satire really easily, because the audience would be like, "Wait a second," like, because he's like literally talking past his present audience that are with him, Peter, James.
Yeah.
Like, who is he talking to? He's talking. It's like what do they call it? Breaking the fourth wall? Like the guy looks at the camera and starts talking to the audience. It's like, yeah. Wait a second. Who is this performance for? Is it for the guys who are in front of you on the Mount of Olives,
right.
or is it for your audience? Are you breaking this like fourth wall or whatever? You know.
And so this whole passage goes on, but
Interesting.
did you have a comment, Albert, before I dove back into?
No. Go ahead. I just said interesting.
Great stuff, Jay. So look, so you get down to he just gives them all these signs to be on the lookout for, right? I'm going to skip past what I really want to get to go back down to this is reminiscent of something we've already seen. So he says, so when you, now think about it, he's talking to people who are alive at the time when the temple is standing. Now the temple is not standing. He's trying to shore up the people who are doubting. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that the end is near at the
that
very...
he is near.
Oh, sorry. So you know that, where's it at?
He.
You know that he is near.
He is near.
At the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. At the beginning of this episode, we talked about, we were throwing the word preterist around, full preterist and all that. You have these positions where people are trying to say, dag, maybe Jesus returned in 70 AD because he's saying all these things will happen around the time of the destruction of the temple. And he told that generation, they will not pass away until they see Jesus actually returning. These are all the signs of the return of the Son of Man. But the Son of Man hasn't returned. Unless he returned in some spiritual way, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But
it just shows you, this is an illustration of just when you grab a hold to a belief and you have blind allegiance to it, no amount of data is going to loosen that hold. Like him literally not coming back, you will find a way to interpret that to make it fit your belief. This is what you call, you're just going to confirm your bias however you can, you know. And the illustration I think of is, it's almost like if you ever taken public transportation and you waited for a bus for a very long time. After a while, the waiting alone is grounds for waiting more. Because you're like,
you've already waited this long.
I waited an hour for this bus. The last thing I want to do is turn around and walk back or figure it only for the bus to come right on the heels of this. So it's like, it's just enough to just keep you waiting just a little bit longer.
Yeah.
And and this has turned into 2,000 years of that, where people are just and in the last days. So now you have Reformed people saying that the last days actually, which it almost just defies your.
Yeah.
They'll say the last days represents everything that happened after the death and resurrection of Christ. And then you have the writer, I believe it's in Hebrews, where he says, just remember, a day is as 1,000 years. No, it's in Peter, 1 Peter. And 1,000 years is one day. So in this way, he can throw off your measure of time to the point where you can't place any expectation in terms of a timeline on any of the promises. You see?
Yeah.
So you have people, he's like, oh, don't think that when we say he's coming soon, God's not slack concerning his promises, because a day is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years is as a day. So this is a way to kind of confuse you where you can't even place a concrete expectation on the promise. So he's just...
Except there is one concrete... No, all that is great. Except there is one concrete thing in there. In those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. So even though you have all these, like you said, earthquakes and rumors of wars, all these things continue to happen. So there's this nebulous timeline. But there is one thing that's supposed to be concrete in there. The sun is going to return, and everyone's going to see him. He's going to come in the clouds. That's concrete. So it's like, okay, yeah, on one hand, you're waiting ad infinitum for this thing to happen, but the thing is supposed to happen.
Well, let's pause for a second, if you don't mind, and just note that for all the people who are noting our apostasy, and they're like, oh, well, he said that people fall. All of the predictions are things that will be happening in any era. None of them are very specific. Like, at no point does he say they will have a Boeing 276 or whatever else. Like, none of them are very specific to, Tesla will be sending people into outer space. He doesn't say that. He says, there's going to be since people started growing, since agriculture became a thing, there have been famines. There's been earthquakes. That's the nature. That's how we got our continents and stuff. That's the present iteration and figuration of our continents is a result of the tectonic plates shifting. So this goes back as long as people have been on Earth. In places where there are earthquakes, there have been earthquakes. So none of these predictions are particularly specific outside of the prediction of the destruction of the temple, which is interesting. If you look at it,
that narrows it down to a time frame, though, of when these things are supposed to be happening, or at least beginning to happen, and they should be.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. But it's just interesting that all of the other stuff is very vague, except for that.
Except for the thing that actually has happened in their time that they can't get around.
Exactly. Which kind of leads you to think probably was written after that thing happened, because everything else is super vague. Why is nothing else very specific except for that,
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah. Right.
So you have this, you're going to see the Son of Man, all that. This generation that he's speaking to, the ones who were present when the temple was standing, won't pass away. So it's almost like shoring up the people who are hearing this, that, it's not going to be much longer. Just keep waiting. But like you said, I can kind of string you along for a while, because no one knows the day or the hour, not even the angels, nor the Son, only the Father. So Jesus couldn't have told us, because even he didn't know. But here's what you need to do. Be on your guard. Keep awake. Stay awake. Stay awake. He keeps stay awake again, right? He keeps going back to this idea, because if you're tempted to be lulled to sleep by how long it's taken and how much of what we thought was going to happen is not no, stay awake. And like you said, Jay Witt, 2,000 years later, you got people who are trying to stay awake for this event. It's almost like now, who needs the analogy? No more analogies.
No, but 2 Peter has given us all the reason to wait another 2,000 years, because he's made days and thousands of years basically equal in God's sight. So that for an indefinite amount of time in the future, no you will have reason to doubt your doubt. If you're doubting it, even the things that have been promised, and you say, okay, he said this will happen, and yeah, guess what? For every person that looks at us and says, oh, you guys are proof that Christ was right about people defecting. I mean, like, yo, it could be.
So it essentially sounds like damage control in some sense that Peter's doing.
To Peter,
that,
he's definitely doing it.
Because exactly. So I had to look up really quickly right now because I had to figure out like when was the book of Mark written, and I think it's what I saw was 70 A.D. actually, and I think that's interesting for the audience to know because the subtext that I'm reading now, because of the fact that it's written, that's the best date that we have, is that the writer Mark is probably dealing with a lot of trauma from the sacking of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And if you kind of go back and reread everything you just read from Mark in that kind of subtext context, it actually illuminates that passage more to me than it is ever.
You try to protect your truth by telling more lies. So it's like Brady's book. I'm just going to use this as a modern day example. His book comes. There are things that people can't handle that he's saying in the book. What do? You mischaracterize it. You say he's saying something that he didn't say. This is the way what we're seeing from these passages, I'm calling it a lie. Yes, I'm saying that Mark is lying. He's lying and he's deceiving his audience into thinking something happened in the past. In other words, that this discourse happened on the Mount of Olives or whatever that didn't happen. So that's a lie. And he's trying to protect what he believes to be a truth that he needs to pass on to other people by using a lie. And this is the same thing. This is what they do. We've seen it. They have a great example in the book of Mark here, and you see them doing it with Brady's book. It's more important to put bars and protect people from thinking antithetically to what we're presenting than it is to tell them the truth. So I'll just tell them a convenient lie that will keep them in the fold.
So another thing that I want to say to everything is just like I'm just realizing that the amount of anxiety that those early Christians had when we're talking about this entire thing about controlling the flock or holding the bars. It's like they had to contend with the fact that why is Jesus not coming, and the fact that itself. Like, that is a lot more to contend with than what Christians deal with.
And they had given their whole lives.
Yeah.
They had given their whole lives to this enterprise. No, you're right.
Oh my
Instead
God.
of doing what...
Yeah, that just illuminated so much for me right
Instead
now.
of doing what we did and
Go ahead,
leaving, they chose to stay in there and to just recreate the myth and say, okay, well... I mean, just think about it. If you were living in a community, in a basically a commune with these people, sharing everything, and then, okay, the temple gets destroyed, all of your expectations get sacked. What do? You either do what we did, lose your whole community, all your friends, and whatever, and your life. You might lose all your will to live. Or you figure a way to kind of creatively weave a new way of thinking of the myth that you believe in. And that's what, when they get confronted by evolution, what do? When they see in the DNA of human beings the clear imprint of our evolution, and there's no way around it, do they drop? Do they defect? Do they drop the faith? No. They just say, well, maybe I can be a theistic evolutionist, So they figure a new way to work the myth into the new system. It's the same thing. They've been doing this is, why? Because higher primates, this is how we interact with data that doesn't accord with what we previously believed. This is a natural response. All we're here to do is to wake up those who will be awakened. That isn't to say that if you stay in these systems, you can't go on to live a fulfilled life and be a good person. I just was debating with Brady the other day about this. I'm totally fine with people staying in their faith tradition if they can live out a full life and if they don't have the doubts, if they're not plagued with the doubts that I have. So for any person who would think that me personally, or that all people who don't believe this they're on a mission to take people out, that's not my mission. My mission is just to make it possible for people who felt like I felt to feel comfortable going on and living their full truth instead of having. But if you're fine in there believing these things that I think are a lie, and you're living a full life, I think that's great. Personally, I can't speak for Brady or for Albert, but I believe that. You see what I'm saying?
We're going to have a whole discussion about that at some point about how you deal with life after faith and people who have a life in the faith. Like how do you interact? How do you go about living with those who continue believing while you don't? I almost feel like what you just said can kind of just take us out. I had one more passage I wanted to look at, but I'm like, I want to make sure that I give the Old Testament some love for this same kind of, putting people behind these bars. I found an interesting one. I was trying to think of something. I was like, you know what? That can kind of count sort of as some gaslighting a little bit. This is a oldie but a goodie. Think about Moses and let's start with Jesus and go back to Moses. When Jesus, I think it's the triumphal entry, where at some point, people are praising God for what Jesus is doing, and the Pharisees have a problem with it. And Jesus says, hey, chill. If these people didn't cry out, the rocks would cry out. Like somebody gonna speak.
Right.
And I thought about that. I said, man, I wonder, like, what if we stopped crying out? What if the whole earth just stopped worshiping, stopped believing in God? Would the rocks cry? Would there be any other, like, God's going to get his glory one way or another? Something's going to cry out. Would God have to, like, appear? And I said this in a part of my book. I said, there's a small part of me that hopes, like, man, if we say, Dad, you know what, we can't believe this anymore, do something new. Like, reveal yourself some other kind of way. You reveal yourself to them, then give us something that we can get with. Like, would God step from behind the curtain if we just said, we can't do this no more? Like, it don't work. Right? Would the rocks cry out? Would you cry out from the heavens? Would anything happen?
No. The answer to that.
But that no, of course, it's a no from silence, right? It's not a no from the heavens. It's a no like we wouldn't get anything. But then here's the striking thing that it took me back to an Old Testament passage. There are some Christians who would say, not no because God would be silent or because God can't speak. No, because we don't even really want God to speak. You know why? Because even when he did speak, it was too terrifying. You go back to Exodus 20, right? Where here they are at the foot of Mount Sinai.
I know what you're about to go with this. I know where you're going.
Here they are at the foot of Mount Sinai, and God actually speaks to the point where the whole Israelite encampment can hear him. And they're so terrified by the voice of God that they go to Moses and they say, no. Don't let God speak to us anymore. You speak to us from now on. And Moses gets to say, that's what I thought. Y'all groveling at me speaking for God, but now that you heard his voice, now you want it to be just me. Now, but think about the cat and the gaslighting that's going on here. This is a story being told to Israelites centuries after an Exodus would have occurred. And they're probably wondering, God spoke to people in the past? Yeah. I don't mean to be rude, but how come he don't speak to us? Well, let me tell you a story about that.
It's an etiology. It's almost like
etiology, right? There was a time when he did speak.
And people were so shook. They were so shook.
It was
so
like,
oh,
terrifying.
We don't want to hear.
Like the voice of many waters. Like here's the crazy thing when you think about this.
I am the great and terrible Oz and so forth.
but do you know what the word for voice is called? Qol in Hebrew. You know what that word also means?
No.
Thunder.
Okay.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
The word for voice is thunder.
Wow.
Because the ancients, when they heard thunder, it was the voice of the gods. And so Moses is saying, or not Moses, the author of the Pentateuch is saying, you really don't want God to thunder at you. You know when that thunders out of nowhere and that huge thunderclap, makes you jump and you fear for your life. Your dog runs it. The writer is saying you don't even want God to speak. You should be glad He's only speaking through men, because if He were to speak, you might die from the fear and sheer terror of it. And the hearers get to say, "Dad, you're right. Let's keep going to the priests and prophets, because how foolish of us to think that an all-powerful God could speak to us, even though He apparently spoke to Adam, right? Pre-fall and post-fall, even in His
He spoke
judgment.
to Moses right there in their generation.
Right, like, so he apparently can use his indoor voice and speak to people in ways that don't terrify them, that don't scare the shit out of them.
Yeah, yeah.
But for whatever reason, they're supposed to believe it's better that he don't.
What reason? He does it so that he can scare him off, so he doesn't have to continually produce miracles.
Right. Right.
Like, even though miracles aren't hard for an omnipotent God to produce, he apparently doesn't like doing that. So whenever he makes his appearance, he comes out with his most terrifying suit. He's like, all right, now they're nice and scared, so I won't have to come out anymore, you know? So he's like, he's on a lazy boy chair or something up there, just kind of just chilling, you know? That is interesting, though, because what it implies is that for every generation, there's a story of, oh, this happened before. So that when you look at it in totality, there is no generation that really can say they saw something happening in their time. You know, you're just always taking on the word of somebody. So, you know, you're perpetually just looking back to some other time when something really supposedly happened. It's interesting.
Yeah. So we are perpetually looking back at when God happened, at when God did things. And we are perpetually living in the last days, the latter times, when people are going to be tempted to fall away because God's taking too long.
Yep.
So
and it's like
in theological terms, the already but not yet concept.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Hold on. I don't know if people realize how good that is. Because already not yet is normally used to apply to theological terms that we want to be able to hold to as sort of happening, but then not yet happening. But man, if that has to apply to the proof of God, it's already in our past, but also not yet. It's going to be in our future.
Right. Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly.
Wow. That's crazy. And it's wild because I used to have this analogy when I was a Christian, when I was doing evangelism. I would talk about people living in this like game of musical chairs. And I would say, people have these religions and these gods that they hold Jesus almost like you tentatively hold that chair in musical chairs, where you think, I know the music's about to stop, and you're kind of dancing around it with your hand on the chair. You're not seated in Christ yet, but you know when the music stops, that's the chair you're going to rush to and sit in. But now that I think about it, I'm like, man, there's this perpetual sense of, is the music's going to stop, and I'm living my life maybe even sitting in that chair thinking like I can't get up because it's going to, I don't know why y'all dancing around me, the music is going to stop soon. But it's like you said, 2,000 years, 2,000 years. When I was getting ready to start my descent or my deconversion, I remember thinking like there's so many problems here, there's so many ways that this text just doesn't add up. That even if God is real, He's got to forgive my unbelief. He's got to forgive He's got to laugh with me at like, this is just too much. But then it just became so much more than that I just was like, you know what, I can't assent to this anymore. But on my way out, I just was thinking, like, if God's got a sense of humor, He's got to have a sense of humor about Himself, looking at the way He's presented Himself to us. But these are the passages that, when you step out, you look back and you say, I can't believe that I allowed myself to be pigeonholed by this faith, by this presentation of faith. As the listener, this may seem sacrilegious to you, Hope it's not too offensive. Hope you were at least able to listen and see how someone who sits from where we are could look and see these things. Um, but as always, you're welcome to comment, share your
Right.
thoughts. If you're not a subscriber, subscribe to the channel. Like the video if you like the video. If you just thought it was good combo, that'll help us to kind of know where we're at and keep this going. You can drop comments. Let us know what topics you'd like us to discuss. If you've got podcast names you think we should consider, you could throw your suggestion in the hat and we'll look at it. But we're going to sign off on that note. We'll be back. As Jay Witt jokingly said one time, Lord willing. Now, we'll be back on this before too long. Much love.